The invitation. The soft hum of Jake's old ceiling fan filled his small apartment as he scrolled through his phone, lost in another uneventful evening. Life on Earth had become routine. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. But tonight, something extraordinary was about to happen. Jake's phone buzzed, and a notification popped up. It wasn't from any app he recognized. The sender was simply labeled Zoran. His heart skipped a beat. Zoran was his alien friend from a far-off planet called Virion. They had met by pure chance a year ago, when Jake accidentally stumbled upon an alien distress signal while tinkering with an old radio. Their unlikely friendship had grown strong, but they hadn't spoken in months. Curious, Jake opened the message. It read, "Jake, I need your help. My mother has invited you to our home. It's urgent. Please respond quickly." Jake blinked at the screen, rereading the message. Zoran's mother. Why would she invite him? Zoran rarely talked about his family, and Jake got the impression that his mother was a powerful figure on Virion. Why him? Why now? Before Jake could type a response, his phone buzzed again. Another message from Zoran. "I know this is sudden, but it's important. My mother insisted. A ship is already on its way to pick you up. Be ready." Jake stared at the message, a mix of excitement and dread churning in his stomach. A ship, already on its way. This wasn't a casual invite. This was serious. He typed back a quick reply. "Why does your mom want to see me? Is something wrong?" Seconds later, Zoran replied, "She'll explain everything when you get here. Trust me, Jake. Just come." Jake rubbed his forehead, trying to make sense of it all. Zoran had never steered him wrong before, but this felt strange. Still, the thought of visiting an alien planet again was too tempting to resist. He grabbed his backpack and stuffed it with essentials, a change of clothes, his notebook, and a flashlight. What else do you pack for a trip across the galaxy? Just as he zipped up the bag, the room filled with a low, vibrating hum. The lights flickered, and a beam of bright blue light shot through the window, illuminating the room like a miniature sun. Jake shielded his eyes as the light wrapped around him, lifting him off the ground. Before he could process what was happening, he was standing in a sleek, metallic room. The walls shimmered with an otherworldly glow, and the air smelled faintly of ozone. He was on a Virion transport ship. "Welcome aboard," a calm, robotic voice announced. A holographic figure appeared in front of him, an alien eye with glowing eyes and a soothing tone. "You are a guest of Zoran's family. Please remain seated during the journey." Jake barely had time to sit before the ship jolted forward, speeding through space faster than his mind could comprehend. Through a small window, he saw stars streak past like silver ribbons. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. Minutes, or maybe hours, later, the ship slowed, and Jake caught his first glimpse of Virion. The planet was a swirling mix of blues, purples, and greens, with massive floating structures that glittered like jewels in the sunlight. It was breathtaking. The ship landed smoothly on a glowing platform. The door hissed open, and there stood Zoran, his tall, slender frame unmistakable. His silver skin shimmered under Virion's twin suns, and his violet eyes lit up when he saw Jake. "Jake, you made it," Zoran said, rushing forward to greet him. "Of course I did," Jake replied, though his voice was edged with uncertainty. "But what's going on, Zoran? Why did your mom invite me?" Zoran hesitated, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "She'll explain everything soon. Come on, we don't have much time." Jake followed Zoran through the alien city. The streets were lined with plants that glowed softly, and the air was filled with a hum, like the planet itself was alive. The locals, tall and graceful like Zoran, turned to stare at Jake as he passed. Some nodded politely, while others whispered to each other, their expressions unreadable. They arrived at a grand building with arched entrances and walls that seemed to shift colors depending on the angle of the light. Zoran led Jake inside, where they were greeted by a regal-looking alien woman. She was taller than Zoran, with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Her silver skin had a faint golden sheen, and her eyes were a piercing blue. "You must be Jake," she said, her voice smooth and commanding. Jake nodded, suddenly feeling small under her gaze. "Yes, Mom. It's an honor to meet you." She smiled faintly. "The honor is mine. You've proven yourself a loyal friend to my son. But your presence here is not just about friendship. You are here because you've been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Jake asked, his heart pounding. Her expression grew serious. "All will be revealed in time. For now, know this. Your arrival here will change everything. For us, and for you." Jake opened his mouth to ask more, but she turned and began walking deeper into the building, gesturing for him to follow. As he stepped forward, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to take a turn he could never have imagined. Arrival on Zoran's planet. A ship glided through the shimmering atmosphere of Virion, the alien planet Jake had only heard about in fragments during late-night conversations with Zoran. He pressed his face to the cool glass of the viewing window, eyes wide as the dazzling landscape unfolded before him. Massive floating structures hung suspended in the air, their bases glowing with an ethereal blue light. Rivers of liquid silver snaked across the surface below, reflecting the light of the twin suns in mesmerizing patterns. It felt like stepping into a dream, one that was both beautiful and utterly surreal. The ship docked on a glowing platform that appeared to hover in midair. The soft hum of the engines faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Jake's palms were sweaty as he clutched the straps of his backpack. He had no idea what awaited him, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this trip was about more than a simple visit. Zoran's message had been vague, and his friend's sudden secrecy was unlike him. As the door slid open with a soft hiss, Jake stepped out into the alien world. The air was cool and carried a faint metallic tang. A crowd of Virion locals had gathered nearby, their tall, elegant frames and shimmering silver skin catching the light. They watched him silently, their violet eyes filled with curiosity, and something else he couldn't quite place. Was it awe? Suspicion? Fear? "Jake." Zoran's familiar voice broke through the tension. Jake turned to see his friend approaching, his usual wide smile slightly strained. Zoran looked the same as Jake remembered, tall, slender, with silver skin that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. His violet eyes glowed with an intensity that always seemed just on the edge of otherworldly. But today, those eyes were shadowed with worry. "Zoran," Jake said, relief flooding through him as they clasped hands in a firm, friendly grip. "Man, it's good to see you. But you've got to tell me, what's going on? Why did your mom invite me here?" Zoran glanced around nervously, his gaze darting to the silent onlookers. He leaned in and lowered his voice. "Not here. We need to talk somewhere private. Come with me." Jake frowned but nodded, following Zoran as they walked down a pathway that seemed to form under their feet with each step. The alien city loomed around them, a mix of towering crystalline spires and floating platforms that defied gravity. Strange plants with glowing orbs grew along the sides of the path, pulsing softly like living lanterns. The hum of the city was constant, a low vibration that Jake could feel in his chest. The locals watched them as they passed, their whispers carrying on the wind. Jake couldn't understand their language, but the tone was unmistakable. He was the subject of their conversations. "Why is everyone staring at me?" Jake asked, his voice tense. "It's like I've got a giant sign over my head." "They've never seen a human before," Zoran said, his voice flat. "But it's more than that. You being here means something. Something big." "Like what?" Jake pressed, but Zoran shook his head. "Soon," Zoran said, "my mother will explain everything." They stopped in front of a massive structure that glowed faintly with a golden light. The building's walls seemed to ripple like liquid, and Jake could feel the warmth radiating from it. Two guards stood at the entrance, their armor sleek and black, their faces hidden behind helmets. They stepped aside wordlessly as Zoran led Jake inside. The interior of the building was even more breathtaking than the city outside. The walls were covered in intricate carvings that pulsed with light, and the air was filled with a soft, melodic hum. At the center of the room stood Zoran's mother. She was taller than Zoran, with a regal presence that made Jake feel instantly small. Her silver skin had a golden sheen, and her piercing blue eyes seemed to look straight through him. She wore a flowing robe that shimmered with the colors of the Virian sky, and her expression was calm but serious. "Welcome, Jake," she said, her voice smooth and commanding. "It is an honor to finally meet you." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Thank you, ma'am, but I have to admit, I'm a little confused. Why did you invite me here?" Her eyes softened slightly, but there was an undeniable weight behind her gaze. "You are here because you are important, not just to Zoran, but to all of us. You have been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Jake asked, his stomach tightening. She gestured to a large, glowing artifact in the center of the room. It was unlike anything Jake had ever seen, a crystalline object that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The closer he looked, the more it seemed to shift and change, as if it were alive. "This is the Nexus," Zoran's mother explained. "It is an ancient relic, older than our civilization. For centuries, it has been dormant, but recently it awakened." Jake stared at the artifact, a sense of unease creeping over him. "What does that have to do with me?" "When it awakened," she continued, "it called out. And it called for you." The room fell silent as her words sank in. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "Why me? I'm just a guy. I'm no one special." "That is where you are wrong," she said, her voice firm. "The Nexus chooses only those with a unique spark. You are more special than you realize, Jake, and the fate of not just our world, but perhaps many others, depends on what you do next." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to protest, to insist they had the wrong person, but the weight of her words and the unyielding gaze of the Nexus told him this was only the beginning of something far greater than himself. The hidden purpose. Jake stood frozen, staring at the glowing artifact in the center of the room. The Nexus, Zoran's mother had called it. Its shifting, crystalline surface seemed alive, pulsating faintly as if it were breathing. He couldn't look away, even as a knot of anxiety tightened in his chest. Why had it called for him? What did they mean by chosen? "Jake." Zoran's voice broke through his thoughts. He placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, his touch grounding him. "I know this is a lot to take in, but you have to trust us. This isn't just about our planet. It's bigger than that." Jake turned to his friend, his brow furrowed. "Bigger? How? What aren't you telling me, Zoran?" Zoran hesitated, glancing at his mother, who gave him a subtle nod. Taking a deep breath, Zoran led Jake to a smaller chamber adjacent to the main hall. The walls shimmered faintly, casting a calming glow over the room. In the center was a circular table made of the same crystalline material as the Nexus. "Sit," Zoran's mother instructed, her voice steady but filled with authority. Jake obeyed, his curiosity battling his unease. Zoran and his mother sat across from him, their expressions grave. "The Nexus is not just an artifact," Zoran's mother began, her piercing blue eyes locked onto Jake's. "It is a living entity, a remnant of an ancient civilization that predates both your species and ours. It holds vast knowledge and power, but it can only be activated by someone with the right resonance." "Resonance?" Jake echoed, shaking his head. "What does that even mean? I'm just an ordinary guy. How could I have anything to do with this Nexus thing?" Zoran leaned forward, his gaze earnest. "You're not ordinary, Jake. Humans aren't ordinary. Your species has something unique, something we don't fully understand but have always respected. It's why we've been watching your planet for centuries." "Watching us?" Jake's voice rose. "You mean spying on us?" "Observing," Zoran's mother corrected, her tone calm but firm. We have no interest in interfering with your development, but we've always known that humans possess a connection to the nexus that we lack. For generations, we've searched for someone like you, a human who can awaken it. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. Awaken it for what? What does it do? Zoran's mother hesitated for a moment, then spoke. The nexus is a gateway, Jake. A link to knowledge and power beyond imagination. It has the potential to save entire civilizations, or destroy them. Right now, our planet is in grave danger. An ancient enemy, one that nearly wiped out our ancestors, has returned. They seek the nexus for their own purposes. And you think I can stop them? Jake asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. I don't even know how this thing works. That's why we brought you here, Zoran said. The nexus has chosen you, Jake. It will guide you. But first, you have to trust it. Jake let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Trust it. It's a glowing rock, Zoran. This is insane. Zoran's mother's gaze hardened, her voice taking on a sharp edge. You may think this is insane, but the lives of millions, on our world and possibly others, depend on your willingness to act. The Nexus called you for a reason, Jake. Denying it won't change that. The weight of her words pressed down on Jake like a physical force. He wanted to argue, to walk away and leave this all behind. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. Something about the Nexus, its pulsating glow, the way it seemed to hum in the back of his mind, was drawing him in. What happens if I say no? He asked quietly. Zoran's mother's expression softened slightly, though the tension in her shoulders remained. Then we will respect your decision, but the Nexus will go dormant again. And without its power, we will be defenseless against the coming storm. Jake looked at Zoran, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and fear. His friend had always been there for him, always believed in him. Could he really turn his back now? With a deep breath, Jake stood and walked back into the main hall. The Nexus sat in its place, glowing faintly, as if it had been waiting for him. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and placed his hand on its surface. The moment his skin made contact, the room was bathed in a blinding light. A surge of energy shot through Jake's body, and his mind was flooded with images, stars exploding, ancient civilizations rising and falling, and a shadowy force consuming everything in its path. He saw flashes of himself standing at the center of it all, the Nexus in his hands, its power radiating like a beacon. When the light faded, Jake stumbled back, his breathing ragged. The Nexus was now glowing brighter than before. It hummed louder and more insistent. What was that? He gasped. Zoran's mother stepped forward, her expression unreadable. That was the Nexus showing you its purpose, and yours. You have awakened it, Jake. Now, it is time to prepare for what lies ahead. Jake's legs felt weak, but he nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't fully understand what he had just experienced, but one thing was clear. There was no turning back now. The secret threat. The Nexus continued to pulse with an otherworldly rhythm as Jake stood there, still reeling from the visions it had forced into his mind. His heart raced, and his thoughts churned like a storm. The ancient civilizations, the destruction, the shadowy force, none of it made sense, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all horrifyingly real. Zoran placed a steadying hand on Jake's shoulder. Are you okay? He asked, his voice filled with concern. Jake turned to him, his face pale but resolute. I don't know what I just saw, but it felt real. Like it wasn't just a vision. It was a warning. Zoran's mother, standing tall and composed, nodded gravely. The Nexus reveals fragments of what is, what was, and what could be. The force you saw is the Voidbound, an ancient enemy that devours entire worlds. It has returned, and it is coming for Virion. Jake's stomach churned. The Voidbound, what are they? They are more than a species, Zoran's mother explained, her voice heavy with sorrow. "They are a consuming force. They infect worlds, strip them of life, and leave behind only emptiness. Thousands of years ago, they nearly destroyed our civilization, but we drove them back, at a terrible cost." Jake's head spun. "And now they're back because of the Nexus." "Not because of it," Zoran interjected. "But they know it's here, and they know what it can do. If they take it, they'll become unstoppable." Jake's fingers clenched into fists. "So I'm supposed to stop them with this thing? I don't even know how it works." "You won't be alone," Zoran said quickly. "We'll help you. My mother, the Council, our entire planet. We'll all fight. But you're the key, Jake. Without you, the Nexus is powerless." Before Jake could respond, a loud alarm blared through the chamber. The soft hum of the Nexus was drowned out by the shrill, urgent sound. Zoran's mother's face hardened instantly. "They're here," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "The Voidbound have sent their agents." "Already?" Jake asked, panic creeping into his voice. "How did they get here so fast?" "They've been watching," Zoran said grimly. "We suspected spies among our people, but we didn't act fast enough." The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Jake heard distant explosions. He turned to Zoran, his chest tight. "What do we do?" Zoran's mother gestured toward the Nexus. "We must move it to the vault. It's the only place secure enough to protect it. For now." Jake nodded, adrenaline surging through him. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but standing still wasn't an option. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay close to the Nexus," Zoran's mother instructed. "It responds to you. If it activates, you'll need to control it." Jake swallowed hard and nodded. As the ground shook again, the group moved quickly, heading down a narrow corridor lit by the same shifting light as the walls. Guards in sleek, black armor flanked them, their weapons glowing faintly. Jake could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken fear. As they descended deeper into the structure, Jake couldn't help but notice how the guards avoided making eye contact with him. Whispers followed him, hushed but filled with unease. "They don't trust me," Jake muttered to Zoran. "They're scared," Zoran replied. "The Nexus is sacred to them. Having it choose an outsider, a human, challenges everything they believe." "Great," Jake said dryly. "Just what I needed. More pressure." Suddenly, a deafening explosion rocked the corridor, and the group was thrown to the ground. Jake's ears rang as smoke filled the air. He coughed, struggling to see through the haze. "Ambush," one of the guards shouted. Shapes moved in the smoke, tall, shadowy figures with glowing red eyes. The Voidbound agents had arrived. The guards opened fire, their weapons emitting bright pulses of energy. The Voidbound retaliated, their weapons crackling with dark energy that seemed to warp the air around it. Jake scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering. "Jake, get to the Nexus," Zoran yelled, firing at one of the attackers. Jake turned to see the artifact lying on the ground. Its glow dimmed but steady. Without thinking, he rushed toward it. As he reached out, a Voidbound agent appeared in front of him, its face twisted into a grotesque snarl. Jake froze, his mind blank with terror. Before the creature could strike, a blast of energy hit it square in the chest, sending it flying. Jake turned to see Zoran, his weapon smoking. "Move," Zoran shouted. Jake grabbed the Nexus, and the moment his hands touched its surface, a surge of energy coursed through him. The artifact glowed brighter, its hum intensifying. The Voidbound agents hesitated, their movements faltering as if they could sense the Nexus's power. Jake didn't know what he was doing, but he focused on the artifact, willing it to protect them. The light grew blinding, and a shockwave erupted from the Nexus, sending the Voidbound agents flying. The guards stared in stunned silence as the smoke cleared, revealing Jake standing with the Nexus, his eyes glowing faintly with its power. "What was that?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. "The Nexus is awakening," Zoran's mother said, stepping forward. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of pride in her eyes. "And so are you." Jake looked down at the artifact in his hands, its glow steady and strong. He didn't feel like a hero or a savior. He felt like a terrified human who was in way over his head. But as the echoes of the battle faded, he knew one thing for certain. The fight was far from over. Betrayal among friends. The echoes of the last battle still reverberated in Jake's mind as he walked through the dimly lit halls of the Nexus vault. The ancient chamber hummed softly, its walls etched with glowing alien symbols that seemed to shift and ripple when he looked at them too long. The Nexus sat in its containment pod, glowing faintly, as if resting after its sudden activation during the ambush. Jake sat on a nearby bench, his head resting in his hands. He'd saved the day, barely, but the cost was beginning to weigh on him. He had no training, no understanding of what the Nexus was truly capable of. The fact that it had chosen him didn't feel like an honor. It felt like a burden. "Jake." Zoran's voice broke the silence, soft and hesitant. Jake looked up to see his friend standing in the doorway, his usual confident demeanor replaced with unease. Zoran's silver skin caught the faint light of the vault, but his violet eyes avoided Jake's. "Hey," Jake said, his tone flat. "You here to tell me I'm some chosen savior again? Because I'm not really in the mood." Zoran stepped closer, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "No, I just wanted to check on you. I know this is a lot." Jake let out a bitter laugh. "A lot? Try impossible. I'm a guy from Earth, Zoran. I'm not a warrior, a leader, or whatever your people think I am. I'm just me." Zoran hesitated, his eyes darting briefly to the Nexus. "You're more than that, Jake. You just don't see it yet." Jake sighed, rubbing his temples. "What I see is a planet full of people staring at me like I'm an outsider. And I can't blame them. I don't belong here." Zoran didn't respond, his silence unsettling. Jake looked up sharply. "What's going on with you, Zoran? You've been different ever since I got here." Zoran flinched but didn't meet Jake's gaze. "It's nothing. Just pressure. The Voidbound, the Nexus. It's a lot for everyone." Jake studied his friend, unease twisting in his gut. Zoran wasn't telling him everything. Before he could press further, a loud beep echoed through the chamber, and a holographic screen appeared above the Nexus. It displayed a schematic of the city, with several areas highlighted in red. "Another attack?" Jake asked, rising to his feet. "No," Zoran said quickly, his voice tense. "It's just a systems check. Routine." Jake narrowed his eyes. "That doesn't look routine." Zoran stepped closer to the screen, his movements stiff. "It's nothing to worry about. Let's just..." Before Zoran could finish, the doors to the vault slid open, and Zoran's mother entered, flanked by two guards. Her piercing blue eyes scanned the room, immediately locking onto Zoran. "Zoran," she said, her voice sharp. "What are you doing here?" Zoran straightened, his expression neutral. "Checking on Jake." Her gaze didn't waver. "The council has requested your presence." "Now." Zoran hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Of course." He glanced at Jake. "I'll be back." As Zoran left, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His friend's nervous energy, the evasive answers. It didn't add up. He turned to Zoran's mother. "What's going on with him?" "He's been acting weird." Her expression hardened. "Zoran has been under immense pressure. But I agree, something is not right." Jake frowned. "You think he's hiding something?" She hesitated before nodding. "We have reason to believe the Voidbound may have infiltrated our ranks. Their influence is insidious, corrupting minds and turning allies into enemies. We must remain vigilant." Jake's blood ran cold. "You think Zoran's compromised?" "I pray that he is not," she said, "but we cannot afford to ignore the possibility." That night, Jake couldn't sleep. Zoran's mother's words echoed in his mind. He didn't want to believe it. Zoran was his friend, the one who had introduced him to this incredible world. But the signs were there. His hesitation, his nervousness, the way he avoided answering direct questions. Unable to sit still, Jake decided to investigate. He made his way through the quiet corridors of the Nexus vault, the soft glow of the walls casting eerie shadows. He followed his instincts, retracing Zoran's steps from earlier. His search led him to a restricted section of the vault, guarded by a single holographic sentry. Jake hesitated, but the Nexus hanging around his neck, now in the form of a glowing pendant, seemed to react, its light pulsing faintly. The sentry scanned the glow and allowed him to pass. Inside, the air felt heavy, and Jake's stomach twisted as he entered a dimly lit chamber. Holographic maps and diagrams filled the room, detailing void-bound movements. But what caught Jake's attention was a glowing console at the center. It displayed a message in Virian script, but as Jake approached, the Nexus pendant pulsed, and the text translated into English. Data transfer complete. Await further instructions. Jake's blood ran cold. Someone had been sending information to the voidbound. From inside the vault, the sound of footsteps made him spin around. Zoran stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. "Jake," he said, his voice low. "You shouldn't be here." Jake's heart pounded. "Zoran, what is this? Tell me you're not working with them." Zoran's hands clenched at his sides. "It's not what you think." "Then explain," Jake demanded, stepping closer. "Because this sure looks like betrayal to me." Zoran's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Jake saw something he hadn't expected. Guilt. "I didn't have a choice," Zoran said quietly. "They have my sister. If I didn't cooperate, they would have killed her." Jake's anger faltered, replaced by confusion and disbelief. "Zoran, why didn't you tell me? We could have found another way." "There was no time." Zoran snapped, his voice breaking. "I thought I could control it, give them just enough to keep her alive. But it's spiraling out of control." Jake stared at his friend, torn between anger and sympathy. "Zoran, we can fix this. But you have to come clean. To your mother, to the council. They'll understand." Zoran shook his head. "You don't know them like I do. If they find out, they'll see me as a traitor. They won't listen." "They'll listen to me," Jake said firmly. "But you have to trust me, Zoran. Please." Zoran hesitated, his face a mask of conflict. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, let's fix this." As they left the chamber, Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of what had just happened. The bonds of trust had been strained, and the battle against the voidbound had just become infinitely more complicated. The final revelation. The tense silence between Jake and Zoran was palpable as they made their way back through the vault's labyrinthine corridors. Jake's mind churned with conflicting emotions, betrayal, sympathy, fear, but he pushed them aside. There was no time for doubt now. The voidbound were closing in, and the revelation that Zoran had been feeding them information, albeit under duress, only heightened the urgency of their mission. "Zoran," Jake began, his voice low, "I need to know everything. What exactly did you give them? How much do they know?" Zoran hesitated, his violet eyes darting nervously to Jake. "I didn't tell them about the Nexus itself, only its location in the vault. I thought I could stall them, give them just enough to keep my sister safe." Jake clenched his fists. "And now they're here, Zoran. They're attacking because of that information. You put us all at risk." "I know." Zoran snapped, his voice filled with anguish. "You think I don't know that? But I didn't have a choice. They would have killed her, Jake. My little sister. She's all I have left." Jake took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. As much as he wanted to be angry, he couldn't ignore the desperation in Zoran's voice. He placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "We'll get her back. But you need to trust me, and your mother. We can fix this, but only if we work together." Zoran nodded reluctantly, though the guilt in his eyes remained. As they approached the Nexus chamber, the air grew heavy with tension. The artifact's glow was stronger now. Its hum louder and more insistent, as if it could sense the chaos unfolding around it. Zoran's mother stood at the center of the room, her tall, commanding figure framed by the shifting light of the Nexus. Her piercing blue eyes locked onto Zoran the moment he entered. "You have something to tell me," she said, her tone cold and precise. It wasn't a question, it was a demand. Zoran hesitated, glancing at Jake for support. Jake nodded subtly, encouraging him to speak. Taking a deep breath, Zoran stepped forward. "Mother, A deafening explosion rocked the chamber, cutting him off. The walls trembled, and a section of the ceiling collapsed, sending debris crashing to the floor. Alarms blared, and the room was bathed in red emergency lighting. "They've breached the vault," one of the guards shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "The Voidbound were here." "Defensive positions," Zoran's mother barked, her voice slicing through the noise like a blade. Guards scrambled into formation, their sleek weapons trained on the shattered entrance. Jake's heart pounded as he gripped the Nexus pendant around his neck. It pulsed in response, its energy coursing through him like a second heartbeat. The first wave of Voidbound agents surged into the room, their forms shrouded in dark, shifting energy. They moved with unnatural speed, their weapons crackling with destructive power. The guards opened fire, bright pulses of energy lighting up the chamber, but the Voidbound pushed forward relentlessly. Jake instinctively stepped back, his mind racing. The Nexus's energy was building inside him, but he had no idea how to control it. He glanced at Zoran, who was firing his weapon with grim determination, and then at Zoran's mother, who stood like an immovable force amidst the chaos. "Jake!" Zoran's mother shouted, her voice cutting through his panic. "The Nexus chose you for a reason. Use it." "I don't know how," Jake yelled back, his grip tightening around the pendant. "Trust it," she commanded. "It will guide you." Before Jake could respond, a Voidbound agent lunged at him, its clawed hand reaching for his throat. Instinct took over, and Jake raised his hands defensively. The pendant flared with blinding light, and a shockwave erupted from his body, sending the creature flying. The energy coursed through him, stronger now, more focused. The Nexus's voice, or something like it, whispered in Jake's mind, not in words, but in feelings, guiding him. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the connection. Images flashed in his mind. Ancient civilizations using the Nexus, channeling its energy to create protective barriers, to heal, to fight. He saw himself among them, wielding its power like an extension of his own being. When he opened his eyes, the pendant had transformed. The crystalline artifact now hovered in front of him, its light swirling around his hands like liquid energy. He could feel its power, vast and overwhelming, but also willing. It wanted to help. Jake raised his hand, and a barrier of shimmering light erupted between the Voidbound and the defenders. The agents slammed into it, their attacks absorbed by the glowing shield. Gasps of awe filled the room as the guards turned to Jake, their disbelief giving way to hope. "Jake," Zoran breathed, his voice filled with wonder. "You're doing it." But Jake barely heard him. The Nexus's energy was demanding more, urging him to act. He stepped forward, the shield expanding with him, pushing the Voidbound agents back. As he advanced, the artifact pulsed with increasing intensity, and he realized something. It wasn't just defending. It was searching. One of the Voidbound agents faltered, its movements jerky and hesitant. The energy around it flickered, revealing a figure inside the dark shroud. A young Virian girl, her face pale and terrified. "Zoran," Jake shouted, pointing to the figure. "Is that my sister?" Zoran's voice cracked with emotion. Without hesitation, he ran toward her, his weapon forgotten. Jake concentrated, channeling the Nexus's power to create an opening in the barrier. Zoran reached the girl and pulled her into his arms, shielding her as the voidbound agents regrouped. Jake's focus wavered, and the barrier began to flicker. The Nexus pulsed, urging him to push harder. But the strain was overwhelming. His vision blurred, and his knees buckled. "Jake!" Zoran's mother's voice rang out. She rushed to his side, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You can't do this alone. Let us help you." Jake nodded weakly, and the guards stepped forward, their weapons now glowing with the Nexus's light. The artifact had shared its energy with them, empowering the defenders. Together, they unleashed a wave of light that consumed the voidbound agents, driving them back into the shadows. When the dust settled, the room was eerily quiet. Zoran knelt on the floor, holding his sister tightly. Jake collapsed, the Nexus dimming as its energy receded. Zoran's mother stood over him, her expression a mix of pride and concern. "You've proven yourself, Jake," she said softly. "But this is only the beginning. The Voidbound will return, stronger than before. And you must be ready." Jake nodded weakly, his body aching, but his resolve stronger than ever. He wasn't just a guy from Earth anymore. He was part of something much bigger, a fight for survival that spanned worlds. And for the first time, he truly believed he could make a difference. The epic conclusion. The battle-scarred chamber of the Nexus vault was silent, but for the faint hum of the artifact, now glowing faintly on its pedestal. The air was heavy with exhaustion and a lingering tension, as though the room itself knew the storm was far from over. Jake sat on the cold floor, the weight of the Nexus power still coursing through him. His muscles ached, his mind buzzed with fatigue, but the images he'd seen during the battle remained sharp. Flashes of the Voidbound's destruction, the fragile alliances of civilizations long gone, and the faint but persistent glimmer of hope. Zoran knelt nearby, cradling his younger sister, Avalara, who had been freed from the Voidbound's grasp. Her silver skin was pale, her violet eyes wide with fear, but she clung to Zoran as though he were her lifeline. "She's safe now," Jake said softly, his voice hoarse. Zoran glanced up, gratitude and guilt warring on his face. "Thanks to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If it weren't for you, He stopped, unable to finish the thought. Jake gave a weak smile. "Don't start getting all sentimental on me now. We're not out of this yet." Zoran's mother, ever composed despite the chaos, stepped forward. Her piercing blue eyes swept over the room, assessing the damage and the morale of her people. "The Voidbound have retreated for now," she announced, her voice firm. "But this is not a victory. It is only a reprieve." She turned to Jake, her expression unreadable. "The Nexus has chosen you, Jake, and it has revealed its power. But its true potential lies dormant, waiting for one final connection." Jake frowned, pushing himself to his feet. "What do you mean, final connection?" Zoran's mother gestured to the glowing artifact. "The Nexus is more than a weapon. It is a link, a bridge between worlds, between life and energy. To fully activate it, you must synchronize with its core. Only then will its true power be unleashed." Jake's heart sank. "And I'm guessing that's not as easy as flipping a switch." "It is not," she confirmed. "Synchronization requires complete alignment. Your mind, your will, and your essence must merge with the Nexus. It will amplify your strength, but it will also lay bare your fears, your doubts, your pain. If you are not prepared, it could overwhelm you." Jake swallowed hard, the enormity of the task settling on his shoulders. "And if I don't do it? Then the Voidbound will return, stronger and more relentless," she said. "Without the Nexus fully awakened, we stand no chance of surviving their next attack." The weight of her words hung in the air. Jake glanced at Zoran, who was watching him intently, and then at the artifact, its faint glow pulsing like a heartbeat. He had come to Virion as an outsider, unsure of his place in this strange world. Now, The fate of not just this planet, but possibly the entire galaxy rested in his hands. He took a deep breath. What do I have to do? The chamber where the final synchronization would take place was unlike anything Jake had seen. The walls were made of translucent crystal that pulsed with a steady rhythm, as though the room itself were alive. The nexus hovered in the center, its glow brighter now, almost blinding. Jake approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the vast, silent space. Zoran and his mother stood at the edge of the room, watching him with a mix of hope and apprehension. "Remember," Zoran's mother said, her voice steady, "the nexus will test you. It will show you your greatest fears and force you to confront them. Only by overcoming them can you achieve synchronization." Jake nodded, his throat dry. No pressure. He stepped forward and placed his hands on the nexus. Instantly, a surge of energy shot through him, and the world around him dissolved into light. Jake found himself standing in a vast, empty void. The silence was oppressive, the darkness infinite. Suddenly, images began to materialize around him. Memories, both vivid and fragmented. He saw his childhood home, his parents' faces smiling down at him. He saw himself as a teenager, sitting alone in his room, wrestling with self-doubt and the fear of failure. The scenes shifted, becoming darker. He saw Zoran, standing on the battlefield, his face twisted with pain as the voidbound overwhelmed him. He saw Zoran's mother, her body broken, her eyes lifeless. And then he saw Earth, his home, engulfed in shadow, the voidbound spreading their destruction like a plague. "No," Jake whispered, his heart pounding. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The darkness swirled, and a voice emerged, cold and mocking. "It's as real as your fears, Jake. You think you're a hero. You think you can save them. You're just a scared little human, in way over your head." Jake clenched his fists. "I may be scared," he said, his voice shaking, "but I'm not giving up." The nexus's light flared around him, pushing back the shadows. The voice roared in anger, but Jake stood firm, his resolve solidifying. He thought of Zoran, of Alara, of the people of Virion who were counting on him. He thought of Earth, of everyone he loved back home. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for them. The darkness shattered, and Jake found himself back in the chamber. The nexus glow was blinding now, its hum a symphony of energy. He could feel its power coursing through him, not as something foreign, but as an extension of himself. "You did it," Zoran said, his voice filled with awe. Jake turned to him, a faint smile on his lips. "Yeah, I think I did." The final battle came swiftly. The Voidbound returned, their forces larger and more ferocious than before. But this time, Jake stood at the forefront, the Nexus' power radiating from him like a beacon. He raised his hands, and walls of light erupted to shield the defenders. Energy surged through him, precise and controlled, as he unleashed wave after wave of pure force against the Voidbound. Zoran fought by his side, his sister safely behind the lines. Together, they pushed the Voidbound back, their combined strength and unstoppable force. When the last of the Voidbound fell, the battlefield was silent save for the cheers of the defenders. Jake collapsed to his knees, exhausted but victorious. Zoran helped him up, a wide grin on his face. "You did it, Jake. You really did it." Jake smiled weakly. "We did it." As the people of Virion celebrated, Zoran's mother approached, her expression softer than Jake had ever seen. "You've done more than save us," she said. "You've given us hope and a chance to rebuild." Jake nodded, his heart heavy but full. He knew the fight wasn't over. The Voidbound would always be a threat, but now he understood his role, his purpose. He wasn't just a guy from Earth anymore. He was a guardian, a bridge between worlds. And his story was just beginning.